Reza Aslan is joining us. His most recent book is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Professor Aslan, since the last time we saw you on our in-depth program a couple of years ago, we have a new pope.
Yeah.
It's been a rise in ISIS, and more people are identifying as atheists than ever before.
That's right.
What's your take on those topics?
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of the Pope. I mean, I'm a product of a Jesuit education, and the minute that I knew that we were going to have a Jesuit Pope, I knew that things were going to be different. I mean, if anybody is familiar with the history of the Catholic Church and the thorn in the side that the Jesuits have been in that church for centuries, I think you knew that this was going to be a revolutionary moment, and he has not failed to really live up to the expectations that a lot of us had of him. And I think what I would say very quickly about this Pope is that he's learned a very valuable lesson from his predecessor, Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, and that is that you can't really reform the Vatican. The Vatican is just too unwieldy for it to be reformed. But you can reform the Church. And I think that the Pope Francis has really learned that if he just simply stops with the bureaucracy, stops trying to overturn the bureaucracy, and instead begins to appeal to the world's billion or so Catholics through actions, through faith, particularly this Amoris Laetitia, which he released a couple of days ago, profound statement about transforming priests from, as he kind of put it, from arbiters of morality, those who are there to sort of signal out your errors, into actual pastors, into people who are there to, and who have the freedom to actually approach situations in an individualistic basis with sympathy, not looking for some kind of hard and fast rule. I think that what's happening in the Catholic Church under Pope Francis is going to be revolutionary.
ISIS.
ISIS, of course, is a phenomenon that we're still trying to figure out.
Is it a religious movement?
Well, insofar as anyone who calls themselves Muslim is a Muslim, then yes, ISIS is Muslim. I mean, I think that this debate about whether it is or is not Muslim is kind of silly. If you say you're Muslim, you're Muslim. That's the end of the conversation. If you say that you are acting in the name of Islam, then we should probably just take your word for it. But to think that that in and of itself creates some sort of generalization, I think is quite silly. I mean, the fact of the matter is that ISIS may be Muslim, but so are the vast majority of its victims, by the tens of thousands. ISIS may be Muslim, but so are the people who are fighting against ISIS, people on the ground who are risking their lives battling this cancer. They're Muslim too. So if ISIS is Muslim, and their victims are Muslim, and the people who are fighting them are Muslim, that doesn't really say anything all that generalizing about Islam itself.
And more people are identifying as atheists.
It's true. More people are identifying as atheists. In fact, there's been about a doubling of atheist numbers, but let's just be clear. That's now 2.5% of the United States. So yes, there has been a surge of people identifying as atheists, but it's still a ridiculously small amount when it comes to the United States of America, which is a country that the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life tells us is 71% Christian. So we are still deeply influenced by Christianity in this country. There's no way to get around that.
Reza Aslan is our guest. He has appeared on Book TV's In-Depth program, where we spent 3 hours talking with him and taking your phone calls, talking about all of his books. His most recent book is The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, Zealot it is called. But we are talking about religion and politics with Professor Aslan. 202 is the area code, 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 202-748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. We'll begin taking those calls in just a minute. Reza Aslan is also a creative writing professor at the University of California, Riverside. Where were you on that day of the shooting in San Bernardino?
I was actually in Haiti. I was shooting an episode of my new CNN show, Believer, which will premiere next year. It's sort of a spiritual adventure series where I go around and I take part in religious rituals in various communities as a lens to opening up different worlds, different beliefs. And it was, obviously quite a shock that it was so close, not just to my home, but to the place where I work. But I think, look, we need to get to a point where we recognize that the United States is not immune to the appeal of these organizations like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that there are Muslims in the U.S., an absolutely infinitesimal percentage of them, but nevertheless they do exist, who feel as though their identity is under a certain sense of crisis and who are looking to these transnational groups as a way of identifying themselves, of expressing their grievances, sometimes in horrifically violent ways. Now, we are nowhere near the problem that Europe has. I mean, let's be clear. We've had about 3,000 or so Europeans who have left to join ISIS, and almost zero, very close to zero of them in America. And I will also say that this overwhelming focus that we have on Islamic terrorism and Islamic extremism in the United States is absurdly exaggerated, and more dangerously, I think it hides the true threat. The Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and 74% of every single law enforcement agency in the United States all say that the greatest threat to Americans is right-wing extremism, right-wing terror. Right-wing terrorists have killed far, far more Americans since the attacks of 9/11 than Islamic terrorists have. You are more likely in this country to be shot by a toddler than you are to be killed by an Islamic terrorist. As awful as the San Bernardino shootings were, as horrific as that experience was, that was the 355th mass shooting in America in 2015. And that year, last year, ended with 372 mass shootings. So yes, we are under threat of terrorism in this country. It's just not Islamic terrorism.
Reza Aslan, your new series?
Believer.
And when does it premiere?
It'll premiere on CNN in 2017.
Reza Aslan is our guest, and Bob is calling in from Overland Park, Kansas. Bob, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Greetings, Peter. Once again, I'd like to say you're a national treasure. I always enjoy listening to you on weekends. My question is, and it centers around my perception of at the dawn of the millennium, we were very worried about the Y2K virus in our computers. I would assert that the true Y2K virus was religion in the form of a virus that infects the human operating system. So one of the things that I've always been interested in is the political assertions that were made at the Council of Nicaea when they made the determination that Christ had been physically reborn and had come back from the dead. We have, upon discoveries of the Nag Hammadi library that was discovered in 1945, conflicting accounts of that, and their recollections of the resurrection is more in the form of persons' dreams and recollections of Christ's teachings, as opposed to a physical resurrection. It was more of a memory.
All right,
anyway,
Bob, let's get a response from our guest. Go ahead, Reza Aslan.
That's a great question. First of all, I agree, you are a national treasure. Secondly, let me just say that I wouldn't necessarily call religion a virus, since it's been around since the dawn of human evolution. I mean, we can go back with material evidence at least 100,000 years ago. But now a new group of scientists who call themselves cognitive anthropologists would say that we could even go back perhaps as late as 400,000 years ago and see signs, very clear expressions of religious impulse in human beings. So if it's a virus, it's one that has been there from the dawn of our evolution. Secondly, I think you're absolutely right about the Nicene Creed and the way that it calcified a particular kind of theology or Christology, I should say, when it comes to Christian beliefs. But not just the Nag Hammadi library, but even the Gospels themselves indicate a wide variety of beliefs about what the resurrection meant, how it was to be understood. Remember, in the Gospel of Mark, the very first Gospel, there is no resurrection. The tomb is just simply empty. And the Gospel, which originally ends on chapter 16, verse 8, simply says that a young man in white told the women to go and tell the rest of the disciples that Jesus would meet them in Jerusalem, and that's the end of the Gospel. By the time you get to Matthew and Luke, you have a real attempt by this early Christian community to say, what did the resurrection actually mean? Was Jesus a ghost? Well, we have a story in which Jesus eats fish and eats bread, so he can't be a ghost. But was he physically, did he have a physical body? Well, we have a story in which the disciples are all sitting around in a room and Jesus suddenly pops in as though he is a ghost. So even in those Gospels, at the earliest moment of the formation of Christianity, there seemed to be an enormous diversity of belief about what the resurrection actually meant. But you're right, it wasn't until around the Nicene period, so the 4th century, that became calcified in what we now know as the Nicene Creed.
Jacob, Rolla, Missouri, you're next with Reza Aslan. Go ahead.
Hi, good afternoon. My question for you was, what were the pagan beliefs and Zoroastrian traditions that affected Jesus and his preachings and actions? Thank you.
Wow, I love that question. I never get to talk about this. Zoroastrianism, for those of you who are unfamiliar, is a religion that was born in ancient Persia, really before it was even Persia. Probably, I would say, around 1100 BC. That's give or take. That's what we would say. So really before Abraham, I would say. Zarathustra, the prophet of Zoroastrianism, is widely regarded as the first monotheistic revealed prophet. He created the very concept of a heaven and hell. He created the concepts of angels and demons. These things did not really exist before Zarathustra began to speak about them. And more importantly, he talked about how human morality is what decides where you go in your afterlife. If you have good thoughts, good words, good deeds, that's the Zoroastrian formula, then you will go to a good place in your afterlife, a heaven. If you have bad thoughts, bad words, bad deeds, then you would go to a bad place. This was revolutionary. Now, the reason Zoroastrianism is so important is because it becomes the state religion of the Persian Empire, the empire founded by Cyrus the Great. Now, if you're familiar with biblical history, Cyrus the Great was the Persian king who defeated the Babylonian Empire and set the Jews free from their Babylonian captivity, sent them back to the Holy Land, gave them the money to rebuild their temple. And so the Jews, post the Babylonian exile, so we're talking about post 6th century BC, were heavily influenced by Zoroastrianism. That's how they adopted these notions. For instance, the best example of this is the concept of the devil, or Satan. If you read the Hebrew scriptures or the Old Testament, Satan is not an evil character. He is not the adversary of man. He is part of God's court. In fact, he is known as the Satan with a lowercase s. He is the adversary, but he's one of God's messengers. God sends him out to do his bidding. But by the time you get to the New Testament, this is a completely different Satan. This is Satan with a capital S. This is not man's adversary. This is God's adversary. He's an evil, demonic being. Well, that shows you the influence of Zoroastrianism. If I were to be very glib, and I am being glib here, but if I were to be very glib, I would say Christianity is what happens when you combine Zoroastrianism and Judaism.
Next call for Reza Aslan is George in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. George, we're listening.
Hello. I have a couple of questions regarding how Christianity reconciles Jesus as God. The one point in the Gospels, Jesus says the Father knows the time of the final judgment, the final coming, but I don't. And then again, and I went to church today, in the Gospel today, and several times after the resurrection, Jesus appears to his disciples and others, but they don't recognize him. I never heard, well, what does he look like? What form does he take?
Yeah. Well, that actually is very much connected to the first conversation that we had, that yes, post-resurrection, there are certain resurrection narratives in which Jesus appears kind of ghostly. You know, the disciples don't recognize him. He changes the way that he looks. Suddenly he breaks the bread and suddenly they do recognize him. Just as there were an enormous amount of ideas and controversy among the early Christians about what the resurrection actually meant, there was an equal amount about whether Jesus himself was God or what his relationship was with the Father. You see this again in the Gospels. Once again, the Gospel of Mark. At no point in the Gospel of Mark does Jesus ever identify himself as God. In Matthew and Luke, there are verses that can be sort of interpreted as though Jesus perhaps is equating himself with God because of the powers that he possesses. He acts by the finger of God, he says, and if he has the finger of God, then maybe what he's saying is that he himself is God in some form. And then you get to the Gospel of John, the last of the Gospels, and in that Gospel, Jesus is barely human. He is pure God. He says, I and the Father are one. This slow evolution is a perfect example of this conversation that was taking place in the early Christian community over what the relationship between Jesus and God was. Again, as with the resurrection, that conversation came to an end at Nicaea when the doctrine of the Trinity, God in three forms, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, one substance, three forms, became the creed of Christianity, and all those other creeds, including the Arian movement, which believed that Jesus was just a man, the Gnostics, who believed that Jesus was just God, that he had no human attributes at all, that actually when you saw him, what you saw was an illusion to a human being, but he was pure God. Those views were violently suppressed, and what we now understand as the Trinity became the founding doctrine of Christianity.
We only have 10 minutes left, unfortunately, with Reza Aslan. Jim in Mercer Island, Washington, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Really good to talk to you again, Reza. I called in a couple of years ago on your 3-hour program, and it was just wonderful. And one question I have is, I know when you came to the USA, you became a Christian. In fact, I think you became a fundamentalist Christian, if I recall. But
That's
then
right.
you went back to Islam. And I'm wondering why. What was the motivation for you to go back to Islam? And do you prefer, I guess you do prefer Islam over Christianity, and why? And I'll hang up and listen to your
journey, Reza Aslan.
question.
Thank you for that question. Thank you. Yes, it's true. So I, was born and raised a Muslim, though really a cultural Muslim. My family was not very religious at all. My father, indeed, was a hardcore Marxist atheist who hated everything about religion. When we came to the United States, this was a time of, severe anti-Muslim sentiment. The early 80s, this was the height of the Iran hostage crisis, and so we kind of scrubbed our lives of any kind of outward signs of religiosity altogether. But I've always been deeply fascinated by religion, always been a deeply spiritual kid. I think partly it had to do with my childhood images of revolutionary Iran. When I was 7 years old, I experienced what it meant to have an entire country transformed in the name of religion. And that never left me. And so I had an abiding interest in religion and spirituality, but really no way to kind of, live that out, at least not in my family. When I was 15, I went with some friends to an evangelical youth camp in Northern California. I heard the gospel story for the first time. I'd never heard anything like this before. It was a transformative experience for me. I immediately converted to a very particularly conservative brand of Christianity. Then when I went to university, I decided that I was going to study the New Testament for a living. And it was there, under the tutelage of my Jesuit professors, that I discovered a different kind of Jesus, the historical Jesus, the Jesus that ultimately becomes the central figure in Zealot, the life and times of Jesus of Nazareth. And that transformed the way that I thought about Christianity, but I was still really desirous for some kind of spiritual edification. And I started learning more and more about what religion truly is. I think this is the core of your question, and that's why I'm so glad that you asked it. I think we have to understand that religion is not faith. These are two different things. Faith is subjective, it's individualistic, it's mysterious, it's ineffable, it's impossible to express. Religion helps you express it. That's it. Religion is a language. Now, it's a language made up of symbols and metaphors, but it's a language nevertheless that allows people of faith to express to themselves and to other people the ineffable experience of faith, of transcendence. And so to me, it really doesn't matter which language you choose. Whether you're speaking French or German, you're saying the same thing. If you're speaking English or Mandarin, you're saying the same thing. And so I truly believe that whether you choose the symbols and metaphors of Christianity, or the symbols and metaphors of Buddhism, or the symbols or metaphors of Islam, you're still expressing the same sentiment, just in a different language. And so I think it's important to choose a language, that's all. I am a Muslim because I think the symbols and metaphors of Islam make more sense to me. I'm not a Muslim because I think it's more right than Christianity or more correct than Christianity. I don't think that way. I just think that the language that it uses to describe the ineffable experience of the divine, the relationship between creator and creation, that language works for me. The Buddha once said that if you want to draw water, you don't dig 6 1-foot wells, you dig 1 6-foot well. Islam is my 6-foot well. But I also recognize, as the Buddha did, that the water that I am drawing from is the water that everybody is drawing from.
A couple of viewers have referenced the longer interview that we did with Reza Aslan. If you go to booktv.org, that was in July 2014, I believe it was, you can watch all 3 hours of our discussion with Reza Aslan online. Just 2 quick quotes from Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Reza Aslan writes that the common depiction of Jesus as an inveterate peacemaker who loved his enemies and turned the other cheek has been built mostly on his portrayal as an apolitical preacher with no interest in, or for that matter, knowledge of the politically turbulent world in which he lived. That picture of Jesus has already been shown to be a complete fabrication. The Jesus of history had a far more complex attitude toward violence.
That's right.
Kim in Easton, Pennsylvania, please go ahead with your question or comment.
Hi. You sort of answered. I wanted to know a brief summary of what your book was about. But if you could go into more detail of why your book is different from other scholarly books on Jesus.
Sure.
Thank you, Kim.
My book is about the world in which Jesus lived. This incredibly turbulent, apocalyptic era in the first century, an era in which the Jews were living under the boot of an imperial Roman occupation that controlled every aspect of their lives, including their religion. And the way in which the Jews, over that first century, repeatedly rebelled against that Roman rule, and how Jesus fits into it. So the quote that Peter just read is a perfect example of what I mean by this, is that Jesus lived in an era in which it would have been impossible not to be aware of what was going on, the political and religious and economic turmoil that had affected the life of every Jew in Judea and Galilee. And in that era, to stand up and say, I am the Messiah, to stand up and say, I am the descendant of King David, I am here to reestablish the kingdom of David on earth, that is a political statement. So if I were to put it in its simplest form, this book is not about who Jesus was, whether he was God or the Son of God or the Messiah. It just makes a very simple argument that whatever else Jesus was, whatever else he was also a man. And as a man, he lived in a specific time and place. His teachings were addressed to very specific social ills. His actions were in response to very specific religious and political leaders. That whatever else he was a product of his world. And so if you really want to know who Jesus was and how to understand his message, you've got to begin by understanding his world.
Joe in Phoenix, Arizona, we have 1 minute left. Go ahead.
Quickly, I applaud your comments on the Pope, especially Amoris Lucretia being a Jesuit product also and a divorced Catholic. It's really astounding the changes brought about. My question is regarding President Obama. Should he be labeled correctly that he's not calling the terrorist Islamic terrorist?
I like what Seth Meyers said about this. This isn't Hogwarts, and President Obama is not Harry Potter. Simply calling it Islamic terrorism doesn't magically make it go away. The president's argument is that ISIS sees itself as the representation of all Muslims, which is absurd. And by calling them Islamic terrorists, we are just feeding that ISIS narrative. That's a pretty good argument. However, as I said earlier at this conversation, ISIS is Muslim for the simple fact that they call themselves Muslim. But just because ISIS is Muslim doesn't mean that Islam is ISIS. I think that's where we get tripped up. To say that these actions, which are so beyond the pale of anything that could conceivably be called normative Islam, that they have anything to do with representing the ideas, views, actions, and thoughts of the world's 1.6 billion Muslims, that I think is just ridiculous.
Reza Aslan, you're speaking here at the LA Times Festival of Books, but your wife is also speaking. Who is she?
That's right, Jessica Jack Lee, co-founder of Kiva.
Kiva.
Kiva.org, the world's first peer-to-peer micro-lending platform. Go and check it out. It lets you loan $25 to a goat herder in Africa, 98.5% payback rate. They've loaned almost $1 billion in $25 increments, fastest growing nonprofit in the world. She's my hero.
And she's written a book about her.
She has. Her book is called Clay, Water, Brick. And it's not just about the experience of creating Kiva. It's about how to think about poverty, how to think about the poor, not as the poor, but as entrepreneurs who don't have the opportunities and who just need that.
Reza Aslan, as always, we appreciate your being on Book TV.
Thank you very much.
Here's a look at some books that are